I'm hoping that tonight we can have a little bit more of a discussion, and I don't do all of the talking. I'm interested in hearing from you all and all y'all. Um, there was an elderly woman in the community, and the rabbi called a meeting with her and went to see her, and he said, "Mrs. Goldstein, you're getting up there in years, very advanced in years. I think it might be a good idea now to start thinking about the hereafter." Maybe he was trying to get her to write a will and include his temple in the will. I don't know, but we wanted to have that conversation. So the woman said to him, "Rabbi, I'm always thinking of the hereafter." The rabbi says, "Really?" She says, "Yeah. When I go down to the basement, when I go into the kitchen, when I go into my bedroom, when I go to the laundry, I'm always thinking, now what am I hereafter?" Okay, it was a little flat. Okay, okay. For those that only are going to listen to this, I'm looking at the faces on the screen. I don't hear anybody, so it's always a little risky. Okay. Uh, so tonight we're going to talk about the hereafter. We're going to talk about what happens after death. The first three classes we spoke about that transition, the moment of death, the transition, the mourning period, the people that are here. But now we want to turn our attention to something beyond that. Now, it's appropriate that that's tonight's topic, because I actually want to dedicate tonight's class to the memory of three people, parents of members of our community, who have yahrzeit this week. So I want to dedicate tonight's class in memory of Shlomo ben Aaron, whose yahrzeit is tonight and tomorrow. I want to dedicate this class in memory of Yehudit Bat Esther, whose yahrzeit was today and last night. And I want to dedicate this class in memory of Leah Bat Simcha, whose first yahrzeit is actually going to be this Shabbos, on Shabbat. And hopefully by the end of the class, see why that's also meaningful. But this make tonight's class and the Torah that we study tonight to be a merit to their souls and bring them comfort and great energy up in heaven. So let's start there. Now, tonight's class, we're going to talk about the hereafter. We're going to talk about heaven and hell. So let's just assess where we are about this, and really, we have to start, I guess, with a disclaimer, because nobody's ever come back from there, right? I mean, the few people that haven't been to us and spoken to us about what goes on the other side. And so everything we're going to talk about tonight, we're really going to be talking a little bit out of our element, right? Now, in general, when we study, depending on the area of Jewish teaching that we're going to study, it's either something we can relate to or something we can't relate to. Certainly Jewish mysticism and esoteric texts are things that we can't relate to empirically. It's not something that we can understand from our own experience. We have to always extrapolate ideas as we apply them from our own experience and how we would apply them outward towards the divine. But similarly, tonight's class, we're talking about the afterlife. We're talking about the experience of a soul detached from a body. That's not something that we can know firsthand. And so tonight's class we're going to be a little deficient in terms of that, in terms of applying these ideas. However, the point of tonight's class is to gain perspective and an understanding of what heaven and hell and the afterlife, what that looks like conceptually, so that even though we can't relate to it in a real tangible way, but we can certainly understand it intellectually. So that's the goal for tonight. It's similar to twins that were in utero in their mother's womb, and they're swimming around there, and one twin says to the other, "Are you excited about life after the womb?" And the other says, "We're talking about life after the womb. There's no life after the womb." So the twin says, "Sure, what do you mean there's no life after the womb? Eventually we're going to come out and we're going to be in the world and we're going to use our mouths to speak and to eat." What are you talking about? Eat and speak, walk. What are you saying? We don't use our mouths are not for eating and feet are not for walking. We swim around here in amniotic fluid. We eat through our umbilical cord. That's life. Nobody's ever come back from the other side. Nobody's ever left the womb and come back in. So there's nothing after. It's nothing. It's just a black hole. So the twin says, "No, certainly there's something. And when we're going to come out, we can see our mother and we can talk to our mother and build a relationship with our mother." The twin says, "Mother? What's with this mother myth? the mother delusion that you speak of. There's no mother. You see your mother, you don't see her, right? So the twin says, what do you mean, where's the mother? She's everywhere. She's all around us. The fluid that we're swimming in, the beat, the heartbeat that we hear, the food that enters into us, it's all from mother. She's everywhere. Twin says, I'm not buying any of it. And of course, the day comes and they're born and they live a nice, happy life. And throughout their life, they're also debating. One says to the other, are you prepared for life after the tomb? And the other one says, what do you mean life after the tomb? Nobody's ever come back from the other side. There's nothing. It's just a black hole. What do you mean there's nothing? There's heaven, there's hell, there's experience, there's nothing. And this argument continues to rage on and on and on. So that's what we're dealing with here. We're going to provide Jewish wisdom on the afterlife. And really the term afterlife, we should already know 4 classes into this course that the afterlife is really not a good term to use, because as we really established, I think in lesson 1, there's no such thing as afterlife, because life doesn't end, right? Life takes on maybe different forms, but it doesn't ever end. Afterlife would imply that there's life is over, and now there's something new. But life, of course, we know does not end. But we're going to use that term because it's useful to us and one we can all understand and know what we need. Okay, so let's dive in. This couple living in Michigan, where it's very cold apparently, and it's frigid, and the husband is going on a business trip down to Florida, and his wife figured, okay, he's going to Florida the weekend, she can get away, she's off from work, she's going to join him. The plan was to join him for the weekend in Florida, a nice cold February winter in Michigan. Down in Florida, the sun is shining, it's balmy, it's hot. She's going to join him. So the husband goes ahead and he arrives Thursday morning, and the first thing he does, he fires off an email to his wife. His wife's name is Sarah Goldstein, and at thisisajoke.com. And he sends her an email, and when he sends the email, he forgets the H in Sarah, little typo, and he just sends it to Sarah Goldstein at thisisajoke.com, but Sarah, S-A-R-A, without the H. And Sarah Goldstein, without the H, opens her email somewhere in North Dakota, and Sarah is checking her email because she had just come home from her husband's funeral, and she was grieving, and she wanted to see, she's catching up on the messages, and she reads the email, and she shrieks and faints. Kids come rushing into the room, and they say, Mom, what happened? What's going on? She comes to, she opens up her email and reads the email to them. And the email reads, my dear wife, I just got checked in. Everything is prepared for your arrival here tomorrow. P.S. It's really hot down here. So, is it too soon, guys? Is it too soon? Okay. Let's take a look. Okay, we'll stop with the jokes. Let's go to page 130 in our student books. Exercise 4.3. Rate the following, if you don't have a book, you just listen along here to this exercise. Rate the following according to the degree of pleasure they would provide you. 1, least pleasurable, 10, most pleasurable. Okay, so on a scale from 1 to 10, how pleasurable are these things for you? Happiness. How much pleasure do you find in happiness on a scale of 1 to 10? How about a Hawaiian cruise? What about a lifetime membership to an exclusive country club? On 1 to 10, how pleasurable would that be? Lifetime of meaning, love, social status, wealth, and wisdom. So if you have your book and you can take a look at it, take a moment and rate all these things. Okay, so we've got 8 things here on the list, 8 items. Rate each one of them, how much pleasure they bring you on a scale of 1 to 10. You don't have to share yet, we'll get back to it. But I want you to take a moment to think about it and to rate them all. Okay. And now, before we get into heaven and hell, we need to set it up a little bit. So we need a little introduction, okay? And what we need to understand is that God is very interested in human beings and human behavior and what we do. And we know that there's this concept. In fact, it's one of the 13 principles of faith. If you take a look at text 1a on page 132, a quote from Maimonides. Maimonides famously, one of his works is a commentary on the Mishnah, which is the primary source text of the oral tradition. And Maimonides, so he codified all of the 630 commandments. We've been quoting that work. We've also quoted his A Guide to the Perplexed, the philosophical work. And now we're going to quote from his commentary on the Mishnah. And in his commentary on the Mishnah, he lists in an introduction to a very important chapter in Tractate Sanhedrin, he lists 13 principles of faith. One of the principles, so this is how now, it's not without controversy, obviously. The sages debate these 13 and they comment on the 13, they explain it, others challenge it, and so on. But the point is, Maimonides' 13 principles of faith are certainly a very foundational, important source text in Jewish thinking and theology. Okay, so Maimonides says that the 11th principle, right, of the 13 principles of faith, text 1a, is that God, blessed be He, rewards those who observe the commandments of the Torah and punishes those who transgress its prohibitions. Okay, so principle 11 of the 13 is that there is this concept of reward and punishment, that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. When does God punish the wicked and reward the righteous? So Maimonides continues and he explains, text 1b, that the greatest reward is the pleasures of the world to come. The strongest punishment is to be cut off from the world to come. In other words, Maimonides is telling us there's this concept of reward and punishment. When we think reward and punishment, we start thinking, am I going to be a millionaire? Am I going to own a yacht? Or am I going to gain membership to a really exclusive country club? What was that in exercise 4.3? But Maimonides says, while that is true, there's reward and punishment, and we can think of material as physical reward and punishment, but really, the ultimate reward and punishment is the spiritual reward and punishment. The reward that will be in the world to come and the punishment that will be meted out in the world to come. Why is that? So if you take a look, why is it that there's an element of reward and punishment in the physical world, the material world, but there's also the ultimate reward and punishment is in the world to come. If you take a look at your answers to exercise 4.3, you might understand why this is. Because I'm going to bet that if you looked at your answers, we probably all answered these questions on that exercise on the table fairly similarly. And you'll notice a pattern, which is that you rated those more spiritual experiences and ideals higher on your pleasure scale than the material ones. So happiness and love and wisdom, lifetime of meaning, were probably rated higher on your scale than any of the other ones. That would be my guess. And that's a little bit of a generalization, but I believe that would be the case. I see people nodding. Okay. So in other words, even for us, human beings who spend most of our time fretting over small things and petty things and material things and thinking that what we're pursuing is the almighty dollar, but really, if we were to think about it, the thing that gives us the most pleasure are spiritual things, the things that are spiritual in nature. And we're going to return to this idea a little bit later as well, tonight's class, towards the end. But the point is that if you want real reward and punishment, well, what's really real? What's really important? What's really pleasurable? What's really uncomfortable? The real intense pleasure and the opposite would be in the spiritual realm. So that the ultimate reward and punishment would be of a spiritual nature, not of a physical nature. Okay, so that's the first part of this introduction. But now that we're talking about reward and punishment, we have to understand what this means. I mean, tonight we said everybody join tonight's class because we're talking about heaven and hell, and people want to know about heaven, and people especially, I think, want to know more about hell than they want to know about heaven. But reward and punishment is another thing that makes us a little uncomfortable. When we think of reward and punishment, so right away what would come to mind is this idea that religion is a way of controlling the masses, right? We want to control people. We want the elite want to gain power. So we start dangling heaven and hell, reward and punishment over people's heads. And what are they going to do? Nobody wants to go to hell, right? So you're stuck. And like this, we can control people. If we prey on their fears, then we can control them. And by the way, that's something that's good to know. Whenever somebody is is trying to scare you or make you feel uncomfortable, or you don't even know if that's what they're intending to do, but that is what the reaction is. You feel in yourself, if you can be in tune with yourself and you feel that you are being made uncomfortable or nervous or anxious, it's not a good sign. It's not a good thing. You should generally stay away from those kinds of people or those kinds of influences in your lives, because nothing really positive comes out of that place. But so that's something to keep in mind as we navigate the big bad world out there. But the point is that it would seem that's what reward and punishment is all about, right? We want a way to keep people in line. Judaism has some very rigid guidelines, it would seem, and there's a lot that's demanded of me. Well, why should anybody do it, especially when we live in a free country, right? Well, the answer is reward and punishment. Nobody wants to be punished, everybody wants to be rewarded. But that's a really, I think, immature way of looking at it. Maybe a little bit of a better way to look at it is that ultimately nobody's perfect and people can't always be altruistic. And so reward is a way of incentivizing people. Imagine if there was no concept of reward and punishment, then if you were not altruistic, there would be no hope for you. So it sounds maybe a little bit more hopeful, but even that, ultimately, it leaves a lot to be desired. So let's try and dig a little deeper, and let's take a look at text 2 from the Rekanti. Let's take a look at this text from the Rekanti in his commentary on the Torah, text 2, page 134. Do not consider the punishments, and this is a 13th century mystic and scholar, right? So this is talking about old texts here. This is not New Age revisionist kind of stuff. He says like this: do not consider the punishments described in the Torah as comparable to penalties a person incurs for disobeying the decree of a mortal king. Not at all. Rather, they are completely natural consequences. For one who fails to observe a Torah commandment is denied the good that naturally results from its observance. It's comparable to one who fails to sow his field and therefore cannot reap a harvest, or one who fails to wear clothes and is then cold. It is as natural a consequence as the warmth provided by fire, the wetness of water, and the satiation of bread. In the same way, it is the nature of each mitzvah to provide the positive consequences that are promised for its observance, or the negative consequences that are stated regarding its transgression. So what's the Rekanti saying here? He's saying don't understand this notion as reward and punishment, but rather as consequence. And that would be a more accurate way to describe it. That it is a consequence, that the mitzvah brings with it a consequence. So, for instance, a person would say, he's not doing a mitzvah, he's going to be punished, right? Well, that would be, he says, similar to somebody who says, I jumped out of the second story window, and I was punished with a broken leg. You weren't punished with a broken leg. It was a direct consequence of what you did, right? You jump out of a window, you're likely to get to break a leg, right? Or the analogy he gives: a guy doesn't sow his field, and then he has nothing to eat. He goes hungry. He was punished for not sowing. It wasn't punished. It was the result, right? It's a direct consequence of his action. So similarly, the mitzvahs are the same way. The mitzvahs are a direct. The reward or punishment of the mitzvah is a direct result or consequence of the action. And so therefore we can understand now, just like if you tell a child that he shouldn't go outside in cold weather regions in the winter without a coat on, he'll catch a cold, right? The child doesn't understand this. He doesn't understand why he has to wear a coat and feel all constrained and bundled up and tied down. He wants to run free in his t-shirt. He's not interested in bundling up. He doesn't understand. But you explain to him, you have to bundle up so that you remain warm, you don't get sick, right? So similarly, God gives us the commandments, and God tells us this concept of reward and punishment to explain to us the consequence of these actions. These actions, you look at them on the surface, you might not really understand or appreciate. So we're told, no, these actions also bring consequences. And so therefore, we can now better appreciate doing those actions. But really, you can take it even a step further and explain that reward and punishment is it's not merely a consequence, but it's also built into the action, right? So it's not like you jumped out of a window and then you obviously weren't punished with a broken leg, but the broken leg was a consequence. A person can jump out of a second story window and it won't necessarily break their leg either, right? But there's something else, which is that the mitzvah itself brings within it, has the consequence sort of built in it. So, for example, a person who has a healthy diet, who eats right, and lives a healthy lifestyle, and exercises, and works out, that's a person who's going to be healthy, right? The health is not a consequence of that lifestyle, it's sort of built into the lifestyle. And so here, what we're saying is that the mitzvah has that already built in. The mitzvah itself has that reward already built in. And conversely, the sin also has the punishment, so to speak, or the consequence built into the mitzvah. So for instance, if somebody were to steal, right? So you could say the consequence of stealing is going to prison, right? Or having to pay back. Okay, so it's not a punishment. Well, prison really is another course we did a few years ago. Or crime of consequence, a different course. But forget about the going to prison. Just the idea of making restitution, paying back what you stole. It's not a punishment, that's a consequence. But there's also the built-in consequence, which is that a person who steals from somebody else has degraded themselves. He's now a thief. He's degraded himself and become less moral, more immoral. He's lowered and demeaned himself. That's sort of built in. And this explains a very famous quote from Ethics of Our Fathers, text 3. The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, and the retribution for a sin is a sin. Right? So remember, we start by talking about reward and punishment. There's reward, there's punishment. What's reward and punishment? It sounds like something outside. That there's God just sits around looking at us and waiting. If you commit a sin, he's going to zap you, and he's going to send a lightning bolt at you. And if you do a mitzvah, you're going to get, and it's like, he sounds very petty and small and vindictive. So we said, no, that's not what it means. It means a consequence. The mitzvah, the reward and punishment is God communicating to us the value, to an extent, of the mitzvah. Right? Or it doesn't just tell you that you should only eat sawdust for the rest of your life. He explains the value of eating sawdust. You're very healthy. Eat whole wheat bread only, right? You're going to be healthier. So he already explains that to us. So that's not. So that you wouldn't tell if you went to your doctor. The doctor told you to start working out, right? Would you say that your doctor's punishing you? It's not punishing you, right? So but if you didn't know the benefits of exercise, you had no idea. You just lived under a rock and you had never heard of exercise, you'd think this guy's abusing me. He's making me do push-ups and laps and squats. What's going on? It's torture, right? But no, when you recognize that value, so you see it in a different, it's not a punishment, it's a consequence of it. Okay. But now we can understand the reward of the mitzvah is a mitzvah. And the punishment for a sin is the sin. What does that mean? So simply what it means is that, our behaviors develop patterns. We develop patterns. So if I do something good, I will start to develop a habit of doing other good things. Of doing other good things, then there's more good things. The more good things I do, the better of a person I am. So the reward of the mitzvah is that it gives me another opportunity to do another good deed, to do another good deed and another one, and that automatically will make me a better person. And conversely, if I do commit a sin, so what's the ultimate punishment? That it degrades me, that it gives another opportunity, another sin, another sin, another sin, and I continue to fall lower and lower and lower. Okay, so that's this idea of reward and punishment. We have to understand it as consequence. And that's true in our lifetimes, that the mitzvah itself is the reward, right? The mitzvah itself is the reward in the sense that the reward or the punishment are built in, they're direct consequences, results of our actions. Okay. Now, by the way, just once we're on this topic, there's really a deeper point here as well that's not really so relevant, I think, to tonight's topic. Well, in backhanded way, I suppose it is, so I'll just mention it. The idea that there's reward and punishment, right? So we explain the Jewish perspective on it. That really we should look at it as consequence, not as reward and punishment in the notion, the way we understand it, which is reward and punishment, that these arbitrary things that happen after you did something, one way or another. But no, it's actually not only connected, but built in as well, as we explained. But why is this something that Maimonides feels is one of the 13 principles of faith? And Judaism is such a deep, profound, vast, broad, all-encompassing way of life, and to whittle it down to 13 principles, and one of them has to be reward and punishment, that our actions are, why is this like a core principle, a core Jewish value that's important to know, reward and punishment? In other words, what if you didn't know that there's reward and punishment? So if you knew that there's reward and punishment, but you had a less insightful understanding of it, so it could be something that could be annoying. And it could be something that's troublesome or bothersome. That this whole thing seems very petty, and God seems very petty. Okay, so explain. But what if you didn't know of the notion of reward and punishment? Why is reward and punishment? Why is that a fundamental principle up there with believing in God and the truth of the transmission of the Torah? Like, why is that? How is that up there on the Mount Rushmore of Jewish values? Well, more than the Mount Rushmore, a very big Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore was 13 presidents. So the one of the explanations is because what reward and punishment tell us, and now understanding it from this perspective of consequence, is it tells us that our actions matter. They're important, right? So this is really sort of another wrinkle. It's not just that God's communicating to us, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and I want you to know the benefits of doing this and the dangers of doing that, right? And so I'm giving you a little insight into that. It's more than that. Just the mere fact that we know that every mitzvah you do has a consequence or a reward and punishment tells us that what we do is impactful. It makes a difference. Because if what we were doing made no difference, there would be no either intrinsic or extrinsic reward or punishment. It wouldn't make a difference. It would be totally irrelevant. And this is an important concept, not to get too out there, but the Alter Rebbe, we're going to quote again from him tonight, the founder of the Chabad movement. So he had said that had God commanded us to chop wood, we would all be wood choppers. And what he meant by that, by commanding us to chop wood, what he meant was if he commanded us to chop wood for no reason, he said, you're my chosen people, and all I want you to do is chop wood all day. And what does it do? It does nothing. Maybe it just keeps you busy, keeps you out of trouble, whatever, but nothing. There's no meaning to it. That if God asked us to do something that was absolutely meaningless and worthless, of course we would do it because God asked us to, right? But what kind of connection, what kind of relationship would we have with God if he's taking the people that he so allegedly loves and having them do meaningless things, worthless things? So God doesn't do that. God gives us something that has impact, that's meaningful, that's purposeful, that is of cosmic significance. And so every mitzvah we do, what we're recognizing is the notion of reward and punishment. It introduces to us the fact that what we do matters. It matters to us and is impactful to us. But even more importantly, perhaps, and this is where you can turn it on its head. When we think reward and punishment, we think about ourselves, right? We started with thinking about a motivator for us. But really what it should tell us, how important it is to God. How important what we do is to God, how purposeful and meaningful this is to God. And we'll get back to this sort of concept a little bit towards the end of the class, hopefully. Remind me if we forget, okay? So let's, but having gone off on that tangent a little bit, let's try and circle back. The idea of reward and punishment, or more specifically consequence, that our actions, our mitzvahs, the good things we do, the bad things we do, have consequence, is not only true in this world and in this lifetime, it's also true in the afterlife. Now let's take a look at a quote here, text 4, from the Sfas Emes, the great Ger Rebbe. It says like this: the fires of Gehinnom, hell, are stoked in direct proportion to the degree to which the wicked fan their fiery passions. Accordingly, we must say that Gan Eden, paradise, is amplified by the tremendous passion that the righteous invest in their Torah study and in their performance of God's commandments. They take great pleasure and delight in God himself, and their deeds generate a corresponding abundance of light in Gan Eden. So we're not just talking about a certain energy or a consequence that we feel in this world, but in fact, we're talking about a consequence that's felt even more so in the world to come, in the afterlife, for lack of a better term. And this relates back to what we started with, that exercise and understanding Maimonides, that the ultimate reward and punishment is in the afterlife, is in the spiritual realm, right? So that the passion with which we commit a sin, that passion, the heat of that passion generates the heat of hell, if there is such a thing. We're going to find out shortly, hopefully. And similarly, the pleasure that's felt in paradise, the Garden of Eden, in heaven, that pleasure is a direct result of the pleasure with which we serve God in this world, okay, during our lifetimes. Okay, so now that we've sort of, with that introduction, now we can get into tonight's topic, which is heaven and hell. There was three healthcare professionals died and came up to heaven, and they're standing there at the pearly gates, and the angel at the gate says to the first one, occupation, what do you do for a living down in the world? during your lifetime. So this medical professional says, I was a cardiologist and I performed open heart surgery on people. I help people and save many, many lives and help people live a healthier life. Angel says, right into heaven. There you go. Next person, what was your mental health professional occupation? I'm a psychiatrist. I help people heal on the inside, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and saved many lives that helped many people who were suicidal live very productive lives. Into heaven you go. The third one comes up, and the angel says, what was your occupation? And he says, I was an HMO manager. I help people get affordable, cost-effective health insurance. So the angel says, oh, that's wonderful. Into heaven. But you can only stay for 3 days, and after that, you got to go to hell. Okay, so let's talk about let's talk about hell. The word for hell, actually, the hell where it comes from in Hebrew, not the word in English, the word hell, but in Hebrew, there's Gehinnom. It's called Gehinnom. Gehenna. It might be more colloquially known as Gehenna. Gehinnom is actually taken from it's taken from a verse that talks about the gay. It talks about again. There's the gay Ben Hinnom. There's a valley outside of Jerusalem, and the people from Jerusalem, the Jews, had left Jerusalem and they'd gone to this valley where they worshipped idols. And ultimately, the prophet prophesies that they're going to be punished for their idolatry in that spot. So gay Ben Hinnom, in this valley of the sons of Hinnom. And so you drop the Ben, you get gay Hinnom, and you have the word Gehenna. In other words, it came to sort of serve as a phrase that talks about the ultimate retribution or the punishment for those who committed sins during their lifetimes, the ultimate punishment that will be meted out to them in the hereafter. So that's Gehenna. We're going to use the word hell because it rolls off the tongue a little easier and we're familiar with it. And also because hopefully we can shift our understanding and conception of hell a little bit. So let me ask you, we'll poll the audience, how many of you are afraid of hell or afraid of possibly going to hell? Obviously nobody here is going to hell because, I don't want to give it away, but of course, but I'm saying in theory, how many of you, if there were such a thing as hell, how many of you would be afraid of actually going to hell? I would venture to say that not just the brave people that are raising their hands, but probably everybody's a little afraid of hell, right? So hell sounds like a really hellish kind of a place. Although some might argue that that's the best place to be because all our friends are there. So, but anyway, so let's talk about the Jewish concept of hell. And I think using the term hell is going to be helpful because it'll help us sort of imagine what that means and sort of shift our perspective on it, okay? So what is it? Hell is essentially a rehabilitation center. It's a place for rehab. Why is that? So we mentioned that the actions in this life, in this world, have direct impact and consequence, right? And we quoted earlier that the passion with which we commit a sin, that passion is then translated into the fires of hell. So basically, when a person lives in this world, they live in this world, and even a soul, you're talking about a spiritual being, a spiritual entity living in this world, but in the body, ultimately the soul starts to sort of smell, pick up some character traits and values from this world, from its experience in the body. And therefore, the soul's also, the body can't sin without a soul. The soul has to animate the body. So even if the soul's not actually engaged, but the soul is in a body, and the more the body commits a sin, the more degraded the body becomes. And the more the soul actually becomes tainted, in a sense, or dirtied by the experience in this world. That's really in the negative. Obviously, nobody here commits sins, and we're all very upstanding people, and we're not tainted by sin, and we're not degraded human beings. But even just being human beings, living a material life or physical life in the material world already desensitizes the soul, as it were, to an extent from its spiritual experience, and it starts to coarsen a little bit and become more connected to the material world. And so what happens when the soul transitions out of a body and is now moving on? The soul comes to heaven, but the soul forgot how to be just a soul by itself without a body. And the soul has a human experience, physical experience that it's familiar with, that it relates to. And so the soul needs to be purged, as it were, from those experiences. So on the more severe it would be the cleansing, the more dirty the soul is, and the stronger the stain, the harder the stronger the detergent you need to cleanse it. But even without that, the soul needs to be sort of purged from that scent of this material world in order to transition into the spiritual world. Think about if you go out into harsh weather or extreme weather, hot or cold or whatever, you need to be properly equipped. You need to be dressed appropriately. So the soul wants to go up to heaven, and obviously it's really nice and sunny up in heaven. But the soul is wearing all these clothing, all these coats and scarves and sweaters, and mittens and everything boots that it started to dress itself in the physical world. It gets up to heaven; it's very hot. That's hell, right? It gets very hot. You start to schwitz, and you have to start slowly removing those garments, the material garments, in order to be able to experience. That is essentially what hell is. So hell is a transitional space where the soul is purged of its life experience, the material aspect, obviously not the spiritual, not the godly, that translates, but the packaging in which it came, the experience in which it came, that physical experience needs to be stripped away so that the soul can now go back to being a soul in heaven. By the way,
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
By that definition, it seems like everybody who's not the most pure of people here on earth would at least temporarily pass through hell, right? Because wouldn't everybody have something that they have to be, that they have to be purged of, that would have,
Yes. So even somebody who's righteous, generally speaking, would have to pass through some type of a hell experience in order to go higher up in heaven. There are exceptions to that rule, of course. There are people who don't, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move along. So we'll get back to that. But yes, as certainly where we are right now in the class, yes, that would be the case, right? That everybody would have to pass through some form of that. We still have to understand exactly what this means. But let's first define what we're talking about when we're talking about hell, right? Because we're not talking. Also, where is hell, right? So we think of heaven is up and hell is down, right? But it's not the case. Heaven and hell are not physical places. They don't have a physical geographic location. They are spiritual places. And by the way, that means, and just to give it some more context, and maybe again, this will become more clear as we move on, but you can have two people sitting here next to each other, and one is in heaven and one is in hell. But forget about the heaven and hell of the afterlife, but even in this life, because we can actually start experiencing the hell of the afterlife already in this world. And relieve ourselves of having to go through that afterwards as well. But the point is that experience, you can be heaven and hell are they can coexist. They can be right next to each other, right? There's not a physical location where they are. So now let's read a fascinating text 5, page 138, about a student who loved his teacher so much that he prayed that he go to hell. We've all had teachers that we've hated so much that maybe we wished secretly, no, God forbid. But here's a rabbi who loved his teacher so much that he prayed for him to go to hell. A fascinating text. We're going to get that in a second. Let's just give background for the text. So the text we're going to read is about a man named Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya lived right at the beginning of, right around the time of the destruction of the temple. And so we're going back almost 2,000 years. And he was one of the great scholars and sages of the Jewish people. And then one day he flipped and he became a heretic. And he renounced everything. And not only did he just not believe anymore or practice anymore, but he became openly hostile and antagonistic of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith, to the extent that he even collaborated with the Romans. In fact, according to some, he actually suggested to the Romans to enact religious persecution, which is something that the Romans initially had no problem with. I mean, they thought Jews were weird, but they respected that they had an old religion that was even older than their own. So it was a weird one with only one God. What kind of weird religion is that? But they appreciated that the Jews had a faith that was even older than their own. And it wasn't until later that they started to enact, and they were just concerned with control and power and conquering territory. They weren't concerned with the religious beliefs of the Jewish people until much later when that persecution started. So he was involved in that. That's how bad he became. He was so bad that the sages referred to him as Acher, the other. They didn't refer to him by a name. You know, the pig, which is like a symbol of non-kosher, right? The symbol of treif of non-kosher is the pig, right? So the pig is so gross that we call it a davar acher, another thing. We don't even refer to it by its name, chazer, pig. Pig sounds like such a pig, you know? We don't even he was called acher. They didn't call him by name, they didn't call him by just other. That's how disenfranchised he was and how the sages regarded him. And again, he was very antagonistic and caused a lot of problems. He had a student, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, one of the great sages in Jewish history. Most, we know, Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, that any anonymous Mishnah, we mentioned earlier Mishnah, which also will relate to later, Mishnah, which is the primary source text of the oral tradition, of the oral law. So any Mishnah was written after Rabbi Meir's lifetime, but any Mishnah that is just anonymous, any teaching, any law that's listed in the Mishnah that is anonymous is his. It means that he was the author of that law, Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest sages, one of the most prolific sages. And he learned a lot from Elisha ben Avuya. And so even after Elisha ben Avuya soured, Rabbi Meir continued to learn from him. And it's fascinating. Their relationship was very fascinating. At any rate, we're not going to get into their relationship. We're going to jump in now at the end of Elisha ben Avuya's life. Okay, so let's take a look here, text 5. Elisha ben Avuya was a former Mishnaic sage who turned to such public heresy and treachery that he was derogatively nicknamed Acher, something else. When Acher died, the heavenly court declared, "We will not afflict him with judgment in Gehinnom, nor will we permit him to enter paradise." What was the reasoning? We can't afflict him with judgment because he studied much Torah. He was a great sage, and we know that Torah study is something that protects us and shields us. So as bad as he was, he had so much Torah knowledge, he had studied so much Torah, they couldn't punish him. But we will not permit him to enter paradise because he sinned egregiously. Acher's former disciple, Rabbi Meir, said, better that he indeed be judged and punished so that he may then enter paradise. That's what Rabbi Meir said. And in fact, what did Rabbi Meir do? He prayed, he said, when I die, Rabbi Meir said, when I die and I go up to heaven, I'm going to pray that my teacher be allowed into hell, so that he can then get out of hell and go up to paradise. And you'll know that my prayers were answered when you see smoke coming out of Acher's grave. And in fact, not long after Meir died, smoke started to rise out of Acher's grave. It lasted for a long time, and eventually the sages prayed that should stop and he should finally be permitted into paradise, and the smoke stopped. It's obviously an extraordinary situation, an extraordinary episode. So we see though that Rabbi Meir, who loved his teacher, felt that his current status of being in limbo, not in heaven, not in hell, was even worse, right? So what does that tell us about hell? That hell prepares us. It's a space that prepares us to go to heaven, right? It's the shower you need to take before you go to out for dinner, right? That's what hell is about. There are stories of great righteous people who did and said things to allow souls that had not found a place, not in heaven, not in hell, to find their ultimate resting place. There's a story. Let's not. I'm going to get carried away, so I'm going to skip that. I'll just share just one anecdote. There's a Jew named Rabbi Yochanan Gordon. He was the gabbai in 770 in the Lubavitcher headquarters in the Rebbe's synagogue, and he was a very witty and sharp individual. Some of you here know one of his great-grandchildren who's named after him. So if any of you know Yochanan here in this group, you know who I'm talking about. The apple doesn't fall so far from the tree. So this Rabbi Yochanan Gordon was a character, And it was one Shabbos afternoon, and he passed out. And he had to be carried out, and he was taken to the hospital. Anyway, eventually he was revived, and they asked him, what's going on? He said, well, I'll tell you the truth. He says, I died, and I came up to heaven, and it was Shabbos, right? This happened on Shabbos. He passed out on Shabbos. So he came up to heaven. On Shabbos, hell is closed. So they said, it's Shabbos, hell is closed. We can't send you there, but we're not letting you in here. So they sent me back down. So they sent me back to earth. That's what he said, right? He couldn't, there's nowhere for him to go, so they sent him back. So hell is a process through which we can ultimately get to heaven. It's that cleansing process. Let's take a look at text 6 from Rabbi Shneir Zalman from the Alter Rebbe we quoted earlier. He says like this, text 6. The purpose of Gehinnom is to refine the soul and rid it of any sickness that it contracted. This is similar to the process of smelting silver, wherein the dross and sediment is burned away in a furnace, leaving the silver clean and free of impurities. Similarly, for the soul to be able to experience the light of the supernal pleasures and bask in God's radiance, it must first be refined in the spiritual fire of Gehinnom, whereby the negative is purged from the positive. Okay, so this is an insight into what Gehinnom, what it's like. But we're saying that it's burnt in a fire, right? So we all conceive of a fire, right? That it hurts. You get it burned. It hurts. It hurts like hell, doesn't it? See what I did there? No. Okay. So, but let's try and understand this a little more. Let's take a look at text 7 from the incomparable Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. He says like this. Text 7. Then an individual will also see himself in a new light. Even in our mortal physical state, looking at oneself can sometimes be pleasing and at other times very painful. Imagine standing naked before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent, without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You will remember everything you ever did. You will see it in the light of the unshaded spirit, or if you will, in God's own light that shines from one end of creation to the other. The memory of every good deed and mitzvah will be sublimest pleasures. But your memory will also be open to all the things of which you are ashamed. They cannot be rationalized away or dismissed. You will be facing yourself, fully aware of the consequences of all your deeds. We all know the terrible shame and humiliation experienced when one is caught in the act of doing something wrong. Imagine being caught by one's own memory with no place to escape. A number of great teachers write that the fire of Gehenna, the other way of saying Gehinnom, or hell, is actually the burning shame one experiences because of one's sins. Of course, these concepts, as used by our sages, may also contain deeper mysteries and meanings, but a major ingredient of this fire may be shame. How else could one characterize the agony of unconcealed shame upon a soul? We are taught that the judgment of the wicked lasts 12 months. The pain eventually subsides. Right? So this really sums up, I think, very well, and for us, probably the most useful definition of the fires of hell. Right? It's not some place that's red, pitchforks, and fires burning all over the place. What is the fire of hell? It is the shame that we experience when having our life played before us. When you come up to heaven, to the world of truth, we say every day in davening, in the morning service, right before the Shema. So in the last prayer, the last blessing, right before we say the Shema in the morning service, we say, basically, we're asking that we not be shamed or embarrassed or stumble forever. Forever. But what does that mean? We shouldn't be ashamed forever. Also could mean not just forever, but in the world that is eternal, in the eternal world, meaning in heaven. So when we pray and we're about to get to the Shema, and we're reflecting and we're actually asking God to enlighten us in his wisdom and allow us to feel dedicated and devoted to his service and so on. And then we say, may we not experience shame or embarrassment in the world to come. Meaning, why would we experience that? Because we live in this world, the world of falsehood, the world of lies, and we are so bogged down, we're so consumed, and we're so impacted by things that are so trivial, things that are fleeting, things that are not eternal. Right? I'm not even talking about pet. Obviously, in relation to the infinite, it's obviously petty. But I don't mean necessarily in sinful, but things that are so small and so short-sighted that bog us down, that aggravate us, that consume us, that demand so much of our attention. And when we see that what we got worked up on in our lifetime are things that just don't age well and don't travel well. And now we're in the world of truth. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. That's the experience of hell. The soul remembering, because everything is suddenly now, we get older, we forget things. But then when we come to everything works optimally. And suddenly you know everything, every last thing you did. There's no hiding. And there's no hiding from yourself. So it's not like they convene this big, audience and people come to just bask in your shame. It's the worst part is you having to come to terms with it yourself. That is the fire of hell, essentially. That shame that we experience. And that's what we ask, that we not be ashamed in the world to come, which means that it's sort of a backhanded way of asking God to allow us to have focus, to have the clarity of mind, to actually see, to not sweat the small stuff, not be distracted and consumed by things that are transient and that are finite and that don't last forever, but rather to focus our energy and passions in things that are eternal. Okay, so ultimately this is hell. The soul comes up to the world of truth, and what happens in the world of truth? We start right before we start recording tonight about finishing off a little bit about cremation and the soul now transitioning to the world of truth, seeing everything truthfully and knowing the mistakes it made in here. Now it sees things in a whole different perspective. But the same that's the experience. The soul comes up, and now its life is being played for it. It has to deal with everything it did during its lifetime, and a lot of it burns like hell. And that is that experience. Okay, so how long does that experience last? Right, Andrew, to your question that you asked before, how long is this experience? So let's take a look at text 8. The Mishnah says the maximum sentence of the wicked in Gehinnom is 12 months. That's the maximum sentence. In fact, there's a previous Lubavitcher Rebbe mentioned that for most people, for most good moral human beings, somebody who does a mitzvah or two during their lifetime and endeavors to do more good deeds and more mitzvahs, 3, 4 months, 5 months tops, and they're good to go. And some people even less than that. The really righteous can get through with Gehinnom, with hell, in a month, and some don't need any of it. Now, this is really a different topic, but for many people, they experience Gehinnom, they experience hell during their lifetimes. That's why you'll find on tombstones. If you walk through a cemetery, so there's your cemetery, you'll find it's very interesting. It's fascinating that the writing on tombstones is a very fascinating area in its own right. But you'll find some people, they write on their tombstone people that maybe lived a very tough life, had a very hard life, people that maybe were sick for a very long time during their life, they would write that they were purified with suffering. They were purified through suffering, meaning that they kind of experienced hell during their lifetime here, and they got it all out of the way before they passed on, right? So that's a process that can be experienced now. A person comes to shul and doesn't know what page they're on, and they experience shame because they feel like maybe they should know better and they don't. It can be unpleasant, uncomfortable, and they're doing something good, which just adds insult to injury. So they want to do something positive, something good, and they feel I'm a stranger. I don't know what's going on, and they feel bad. That's a hell experience that helps sensitize, hopefully, the individual. So what happens? You go to hell. Since now that we understand hell in this proper context of a place where the soul is purged of that memory of the material world and all the things, the distractions that it was engaged in during its lifetime, and that shame eventually subsides because all of that is cleansed and washed away. Because as we know, also, a mitzvah, a good deed is infinite, lasts forever. A bad deed is finite; it doesn't last forever. Right? That's another thing, by the way. Another way to not get through hell. We mentioned actual hell. We mentioned suffering, but there's also tshuva, repentance. A person repents for their sins; they get washed away, they get cleansed. If it's a really true high level of repentance, then it's cleansed during their lifetime through that process of repentance. And so therefore, there's nothing there to replay. There's nothing negative to replay. It's all good news. So that is another method. But the point is that I don't know what the point is. I've lost my train of thought. So let's keep going. Text 9. Where do we go from hell? Everybody goes to heaven. As we know, all dogs go to heaven. So obviously, it would follow that we go to nobody. Okay, you didn't get a rise anyway. Fine. Text 9.
Rabbi, can I ask one more question before
Yes, sir.
you take us all from hell to heaven?
Yeah. You want to stay in hell for another couple of minutes?
I prefer to move on in the least amount of the 12-month window as is available to me. Let's put it that way. But a question for you. I mean, if the maximum period that someone should be there to clean their soul is a period, does that apply no matter what you did in your life? I mean, if you take the most extreme, horrific of people, the God forbid Hitlers of the world, are they
right
cleansed and move on in 12 months?
Okay, so to be fair, we're generalizing here. Okay, 99.9% of people, 12 months is the maximum. There are exceptions, though. There are always exceptions to every rule. So there are exceptions. When you bring up Hitler, that's really a different story. I think that to say that Hitler is just sitting in hell and burning in hell, I think would be to diminish just how evil he was and what he did. I think that hell is not hot enough for him. So that's really off tonight's topic. So I don't know that Hitler is just sitting around roasting and toasting in hell. That's not, I don't know that that would be sufficient. There are things that could be even worse than that. But we're talking about now, we're generalizing now. And we're saying that even the worst of sinners, right? Not somebody like a Hitler. Hitler would be an exception to that rule and his ilk. But the majority, even the worst sinner, and certainly from let's call it from an observant, traditional Jewish perspective and practice, somebody who didn't do anything, never went to shul, not even Yom Kippur, right? The maximum, so even looking at it from that, which is kind of a petty way to sort of put it, but just so we can relate to that, 12 months, that would be the most. That would be maximum, okay?
Thank you.
What happens after? It's text 9. Each member of the Jewish people has a portion in the world to come. As it is stated, your people are all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which I take pride. Okay? So regardless of where we are, we're all righteous and we're all going to heaven. Okay? So that's where we're headed. Now, we defined hell. And we defined hell as the shame, the embarrassment that one experiences when coming to terms and face to face with their choices and decisions that they made and the things that they were caught up with during their lifetime, and the purging, the cleansing of the sin and the staining that is attached to the individual. Think about it. You go to the hygienist, right? If you don't brush your teeth, you don't floss your teeth, and you don't take care of your oral hygiene, when you're going to go eventually to the hygienist, your gums are going to bleed like hell, right? It's going to hurt like hell. It's going to be a hellish experience, right? The better care you take of your teeth and your gums, the less staining there's going to be on the teeth, the less inflammation is going to be in the gums, the less there's going to be bleeding, the less hellish the experience. There's going to be some kind of a hellish experience because you need to clean them. That's why you're going, right? But you can't compare. So the degree of hell is dependent on how much staining has to come out, how unfamiliar your gums are to the feel of the brush, to which they'll react, right? So that's hell. But what is heaven? So we're all going to heaven. Now, what's in heaven? Right? We started before. Nobody wanted to go to hell, right? Okay, so we talked about hell. Everybody's afraid of hell. What about heaven? Does everybody want to go to heaven? I mean, we all want to stay here, right? We all want to go to heaven? Okay. Just polling the audience. We're know if we're on the same page. So what is heaven? Now, remember the disclaimer I made in the beginning that we can't fully ever understand these concepts, right? Because we're physical beings and we're talking about a spiritual experience. So it's hard to explain. It's like you can't explain to a blind person what colors look like, right? There's a guy who was they had cell phones, and his wife couldn't understand. What's a cell phone? How do you have cell phones? Without wires, how does it work? So he says, look, before I can explain to you how a cell phone works, I have to explain to you how a landline works, okay? Okay, so how does a landline? Nobody in our class even knows what a landline is anymore. But you remember back in the olden days, there were landlines. Those were phones that were plugged into a wall that had phone wires and cables that went all the way to the telephone station. So the guy starts explaining to us, I'm explaining to you how a landline works. And then you'll understand how a cell phone works. How does a landline work? Okay, so picture a dog. Yeah, a dog. Now this dog is not just any old dog. This is a huge dog. It's so big that its head is here in our house, but its body extends all the way down the street, all the way through the neighborhood, and its tail is so long that it reaches the other end of the city. So the head of the dog is here. Could you picture such a huge dog, head in our house, but its tail always stretches to the other end of the city? Yeah, sure, I could picture such a big dog. Imagine it. Yeah, I could picture the dog. Okay, now imagine you pull the dog's tail at the other end of the city, and the dog barks in our house. Does that make sense? Sure. Says, okay, so that's a landline. What's a cell phone? The same thing without the dog. No? They're not landing the same as last week. Okay. Okay. So what is heaven? It's the same thing without the. Never mind. Okay. Let's just have it sounds like I'm beating a dead dog. No, also not working. Okay. Text 10, page 143. This is from the Abravanel, a great Portuguese thinker. He says like this. Spiritual reward, yeah, text 10, you with me? Spiritual reward is abstruse and difficult for mortal intellect to visualize and grasp as long as the intellect remains attached to a corporeal body. Just as one who is blind cannot grasp the concept of colors, so the spirit that is engaged with corporeality cannot grasp purely spiritual matters. So having said that, we're now going to attempt to understand these spiritual matters, okay? What is the world to come? What is heaven? Text 11, the Talmud. In the hereafter, there is no eating, drinking, procreation, commerce, jealousy, hatred, or competition. Rather, the righteous sit, their heads adorned with crowns, and they delight in the radiance of the divine presence. What does that mean? What is really the ultimate pleasure? Yeah, so we're saying here that heaven is all about pleasure and not any of these other things. There's no jealousy, nothing that we experience in this world. What is it? The delight in the radiance of the divine presence. There's a certain pleasure that we get in our relationships with others. As human beings, we're social creatures, but we're not just social creatures. We have a need to connect with others. We have a need to be connected. You know, one of the most unhealthy things for a person is to be lonely, to be alone. Right at the beginning of Genesis, right at the beginning of the story of creation, God says, it's not good for man to be alone. Right? That's the first thing that we know about man, is that it's not good for him to be alone. This was uttered when man was in fact alone. There's nobody else. There's just one androgynous being. It's not good. That's the first thing we know about man. Being alone is not good. So as human beings, we have a need for a relationship. And there are all kinds of relationships, right? And an intimate relationship takes on all different shapes and sizes. There are different types of intimate relationships we experience with a spouse, we experience with a sibling, we experience with a friend, we experience with a parent, with a child. But these are intimate relationships. And those are the things that these bonds with others, that's the experience of pleasure of paradise. The pleasure of the world to come is the righteous sitting and delighting in the presence of God. The delight of being in the presence of God, of connecting with God, of being close to God. That intimacy, that's the pleasure of the world to come. And that's something that we can appreciate even today. Yeah, so maybe we can't appreciate the pleasure of being close to God, but we can certainly appreciate the pleasure of being close to the people that we love. And so that pleasure times infinity, that's the pleasure that we experience in paradise. So that's the pleasure, being close to your source, to God. And certainly, I guess the opposite would be, right, that feeling of hell is a feeling of shame we talked about, but also certainly a feeling of loneliness. Now, what's interesting is that this idea of intimacy and the idea of this relationship, the closeness relationship, the pleasure relationship, it doesn't come from nowhere. It's something that God embedded in us as human beings, and something that's embedded and printed on the DNA of the soul as well. And why is that? Because God is the same way. And that will, hopefully, I want to put that thought on ice for a moment. Now, so what is heaven? Heaven is a place of pleasure. What kind of pleasure? What's the pleasure of heaven? It's not angels feeding you grapes and another angel sitting and playing the harp next to you while you float around in a in a toga. That's not what paradise is all about. That's not heaven. Heaven is the delight, the pleasure that we feel from feeling close to God. Now, heaven itself, though, also is not a very relaxing place. It's a very pleasurable place, but it's not a relaxing place. So this famous statement that the righteous don't rest. We often say, may he rest in peace, right? May she rest in peace. We don't want the people who have passed to rest at all. I mean, yes, not dismissing it entirely, but just for the purpose of tonight's conversation, they don't rest in heaven. There's no rest in heaven because they're constantly moving upwards and onwards. There's constant growth even in heaven, right? Or reaching higher and higher. You get closer to God and closer to God, just like in our relationships. Our relationships hopefully continue to develop. They're fluid. They're dynamic. They're not stagnant. A real dynamic relationship is constantly deepening and growing. Those bonds grow deeper and deeper, so they don't remain in one place. So the deeper the connection to God, the deeper that feeling of closeness, the greater the pleasure, the higher, so to speak, the soul is ascending in heaven. The closer it's getting to its source. When does it ever get to the end? It doesn't. God is infinite. It's an infinite rise. And so the soul is constantly rising because as the soul continues to delight in the pleasure of God, it becomes more spiritual, more sensitive, and therefore higher and higher. But once a year, on a yard site, a soul takes a quantum leap. On the yard site, the soul jumps higher than the incremental progression that it goes throughout its time in heaven, which is why a yard site is a special time and is observed here on earth by the people who love the soul. And that's why it's observed, it's marked, and good things are done on a yard site, right? Because the soul is rising. And since the soul is rising, we want to connect with the elevating soul so that we too can be elevated by holding onto the coattails of that soul. And conversely, by us celebrating or observing, commemorating the yard site for the soul, that propels the soul even higher. Because as we mentioned in the past, once the souls go to heaven, yes, they're not resting, they're constantly progressing, but there's no more action in heaven, right? Heaven is in the end a retirement home for souls. So yes, the more sensitive they become, the deeper that bond becomes, the more they're progressing, but they're not doing anything, right? They're just living on the interest. They're just coasting. We, the loved ones that remain down here in this world, when we live a proper life, we actually help the soul propel even higher. So there's the things we do on the day of a yard site to help the soul reach even higher. But even throughout the year, whenever we do anything, and there's this fascinating text you can read on your own text 12, where it talks about the fact that children, in particular, of parents and other close relatives, when you live your life and your parents are in heaven, but you're living a good life, because of your parents, because of the way they raised you, because of the impact they had, because of the way they nurtured you. And even if they were not perfect, nobody's ever perfect, but you live your life inspired, that impacts them because they're still having an impact down here. So they're not in this world, and they can't impact the world directly themselves. They're not engaged in the world directly, but they're engaged in the world vicariously through you. And so therefore, your impact directly, you do here, your actions down here directly impact them in heaven. What impacts them? The good things that we do impact them and allow them to rise even higher. And so when one of the ways we know, we mentioned last week, that honoring our parents doesn't end when the parents pass away. We're still obligated to honor our parents even after they pass away. And one of the ways of doing that is by living a proper life. That is what helps them keep going because it's to their credit. It's the fruits of their labor that are still paying dividends. What about somebody that you weren't directly related to, didn't have that direct relationship with, didn't have influence you in that way? Even so, doing so in that case, so when you're a child, just living your life, by default, the default position is that it benefits your parents because it's like Victor Borge used to say, I'd like to, at the end of his shows, he would say, I'd like to thank my parents for making tonight possible and my wife and children for making it necessary. So you thank your parents for making it possible, right? The fact that we're living is all thanks to our parents. So that continues to benefit them in the world to come by default. Somebody else. So there, it's good to say, I'm going to do something in honor of somebody, in memory of somebody. So you give charity, every time you give charity, if your parents are in heaven, they benefit from the charity that you gave. But maybe you want to give charity for somebody else. So then you can say, I'm giving charity in memory of so-and-so. And like that, your action also gets linked to them, right? So there you have to be sort of more deliberate and more purposeful when you're doing something. But for your parents, for the loved ones, the ones close to you that directly impacted your life, you don't even have to make that, doesn't have to be that purposeful, because by default, it already is attributed to them to some extent. They get some of the credit, and therefore it benefits them automatically. Okay. Further, during the first 12 months in particular, it's crucial that we do things in memory of our loved ones, because during those first 12 months, that is the most difficult of transitional periods for the soul. And the more help we can give the soul, the more benefit we can have for the soul, the better. And the better that transition for the soul. But we know every transition is uncomfortable and difficult and challenging. So the same is true. Even a soul that's going straight to heaven, the transition by default would be challenging or harrowing, and it could be traumatic. And so the things that we do, particularly in the first 12 months, are also very beneficial to the soul. And then, of course, we have the first 12 months, we have the yard sites, and then, of course, we have the times that we say Yizkar. 4 times a year that we say Yizkar, on Yom Kippur, on the 8th day of Sukkot, on the 8th day of Passover, and on the 2nd day of Shavuot, when we say Yizkar. That's the prayer, the memorial prayer where we remember our loved ones. And so that prayer as well is something that benefits the soul, but more so than the prayer, if for those of you who are familiar with the prayer, and if you've said the prayer, we say in the prayer that I'm giving charity for their soul, right? And a merit of the charity that I'm giving to invoke their memory. So it's not just the actual coming to the synagogue or reciting the prayer, Yizkar prayer, but it's really the most important component of that is the charity that you give before the holiday in their memory, because that's a concrete act that we do. And you take a look at figure 4.2. There's a partial list here we have of things that suggested mitzvahs to do for somebody who's passed away. Figure 4.3. Not everybody here has books, so I think I'll read through them, because this is sort of a common sort of experience. Certainly this week in Shul here, we have minions every day suddenly, because it's a week of yard sites in the community. And so it would be good to be familiar with this. So let's take a look at figure 4.2. I'll just read them out loud. Yep. Things to do to benefit the souls of the departed. Donate to charity, especially in the first year after the passing. Donate daily, even if only a small amount. Particularly opportune times to give charity are before praying and before lighting Shabbos candles. That's 1. 2, attend Yizkar services and pledge to give charity in memory of the deceased. Now, by the way, in the first year, one doesn't say Yizkar because you haven't forgotten. There's no need to say, I need to recall, because there's still presence in your memory, but you do participate in Yizkar, and you can certainly give to charity, studying Torah in their memory, provide financial support to Torah students and scholars or institutions of Torah study and education, sponsor a Torah class, sponsor or donate books or Torah and Jewish practices to synagogue or library, and write or donate a Torah scroll in the deceased's honor. So you see, actually, number 1 is charity, right? The 2 things, I would say 1A and 1B, and no particular order, would be Torah study or related to Torah study. Remember, we quoted text 5, we're reading that Elisha ben Avuya, he was so bad, but they couldn't punish him because of all the Torah he had studied. As bad as he had been, as corrupted as he has become, as much as he threw everything away, the fact that he had studied so much Torah and was such a scholar prevented him from being burned by the fires of hell. But there had to be a special dispensation granted for that to happen, right? Because the Torah study that he had was so strong. So we see there's a direct connection between Torah study, which is really a bit broader than the conversation I want to have tonight, so let's leave it. But the point is, the Torah study, or something related to Torah study, writing a Torah scroll, donating, sponsoring Torah books, sponsoring a Torah class, sponsoring Torah education, Jewish education, and certainly studying Torah yourself is something that's very beneficial to the soul. And of all the mitzvahs, while all of them are great, charity in particular is great. And why is charity particularly great? Besides the fact that charity is perhaps the greatest of mitzvahs in many regards, charity is also the most physical of mitzvahs. You're talking about the most physical, mundane of things, money, giving money, or if it's not money, giving something tangible and physical, something material, and giving of it to help somebody else, to give and to provide somebody else with what? With material, physical life. And we know the principle that the beginning is rooted in the end in the beginning. The ultimate divine experience is here in this physical world. So the most physical of acts that we perform in this world has the most profound of impacts on the most spiritual of souls in the most spiritual places in heaven. So the most physical act by the most physical person in the most physical place has the strongest impact on the most spiritual beings in the most spiritual places, right? So that's why charity is a big thing. Okay, let's go to figure 4.3. A mitzvah done in the merit of the deceased is beneficial for the soul. Especially beneficial are good deeds whose observance the deceased encouraged in his or her will, or those in which the deceased excelled. Right. So that would be particular to any case. If there was a mitzvah that somebody said in their will, and Jewish wills generally tend to be more ethical sort of wills. If there's one thing they wanted to be particular in, so doing that obviously would take precedence. Or if there was one mitzvah in which they excelled, they were the president of the Bikur Cholim Club to visit the sick. That mitzvah would be something that they excelled at. That would be a mitzvah to do specifically that mitzvah in their memory, right? But generally, without that, what is some of the practice of a yahrzeit? So we light a 24-hour yahrzeit candle, right? At nightfall, right before the yahrzeit begins, you'd light the 24-hour candle. Recite the Kaddish during all the day's prayers. If possible, lead the congregational services. Visit the grave and recite chapters of Psalms. Donate to charity. Study Torah, especially Mishnah. The word Mishnah, which we've been quoting Mishnah here tonight, and I've been throwing around the word Mishnah as the foundational text of the oral tradition. The word Mishnah, which means to study, to review, has the same letters as the word Neshama, which means soul. So we see there's a special link between these two words and these two concepts, the connection between the soul and specifically Mishnah as an area of Torah that should be studied for the soul. Receive an aliyah to the Torah on the Shabbat preceding the yahrzeit. Sponsor a Kaddish for your congregation. The blessings recited there serve as a merit for the soul. Convene a gathering of relatives and friends to commemorate the deceased and discuss and learn from the deceased's good deeds. All of these are acts and customs and practices that are ways to honor the individual, but also for the purpose of our conversation tonight, it also serves to help the soul rise even higher in heaven. It's to the benefit of the soul. We're going to take a look now, quickly. It's getting late early here tonight. So let's take a look at text 13, the Kaddish. We're not going to read the whole text, but for many, this concept of mourning, of Shiva, of burial, of yahrzeit is related to Kaddish very much, right? We know people need minyan. Why do they need a minyan? They want to say Kaddish. Now, it's interesting that, what is it about Kaddish? So let's just focus on Kaddish. We talked a little bit about Torah study, we talked a little bit about charity. What's so fascinating about Kaddish? What's so significant about Kaddish? In fact, if you read the Kaddish, and I encourage you to read the entire translation of the text on page 13, text 13 on page 149, Kaddish is an Aramaic word which means to sanctify or sanctification, right? And this prayer is an Aramaic prayer where we sanctify God's name. It doesn't talk about the deceased. It doesn't talk about the departed. It doesn't talk about life. It doesn't talk about death. It doesn't talk about any of these things. It's simply a prayer of sanctifying God's name, exalting God's name, glorifying God's name. What connection does this have with yahrzeit, with the passing of a soul? What connection could there be? So I'm going to offer one, and then we're going to read a beautiful text, text 14, for another insight. But I want to offer something interesting because I think it actually relates kind of to what we talked about, I think, tonight and what we've been talking about in past classes as well. So I want to turn your attention. Take a look at text 13. Let's just read the first paragraph, yeah? Yiskadal v'yiskadash shmei Rabbi, right? Which translates as exalted and hallowed be his great name. Everybody says amen. What's the next phrase? Be'almad divrach hiruteh. Throughout the world which he has created according to his will. Right? And so on, and continue, establish, and so on and so forth. The verse continues, the phrase continues. But throughout the world which he has created according to his will. So here's a little thought. Obviously, this text is referring to God, the world which God has created through his will, because this is a prayer where we're talking about sanctifying God, right? But I want to give it a little bit of a different perspective on it tonight. The world which he, meaning the deceased, has created according to his will. It's a subtle reference to the person for whom you're saying Kaddish. The world which he has created according to his will. We all live our life, and we create so much of the reality that we live in. The world that we inhabit and the world that we navigate through or slog our way through or thrive through or fly through or cruise through, all that world is a world that we've created according to our will, exactly the way we willed it. Now, on the other side, sometimes some of that will is not so kosher and it can be painful. But so much of that will, and the true will, because every Jew's true will is to do what God wants, is to do the right thing, is to do what they were created for. And so now they're in a world of truth. And we talk about the world, we reflect on the world they created according to their own will. And what's their deepest will? Their deepest will is to do what God created them for. And even deeper than that, we started talking about paradise and heaven. And what's heaven? Heaven is the place of pleasure. What kind of pleasure? The pleasure and delighting the close of God. What is our deepest desire and will? Is to be close to God. We yearn for a connection with another human being, and even more so as well with God. So many people have such a hard time in this lifetime because the physical world and the trappings of the material body are so suffocating to them. And often it leads to chaos, and it leads to addictions, and it leads to destruction and implosion. It can lead to terrible things. But what's under the surface is this desire to break free of those trappings and connect with the divine. That the human being a soul in a body, doesn't interpret properly, can't understand, but it just causes them existential angst. And really what it is they're looking for an outlet, for a way to connect with God. That's what they're yearning for. So let's move on though to text 14, an insight into the Kaddish, and why Kaddish is an important prayer that's related to Yartzeit and said in memory of the departed. And this is a text from Rabbi Adim Even Yisrael Steinzatz, who just passed away a couple of months ago. And so it's really a fitting tribute, I think, as well to him. Everything we've talked about tonight about Torah study and the memory of somebody, the merit of somebody. So this is Rabbi Steinzatz, whose children are currently saying Kaddish for him. This would be a nice tribute to him. This is Rabbi Steinzatz on Kaddish. Let's take a look at text 14. Every member of the community of Israel is, in a sense, among those who establish and proclaim God's sovereignty in this world. As the verse states, "You, Israel, are my witness," God declares. Therefore, the absence of any individual creates a void, as it were, in God's sovereignty in the world. Right? In other words, if we all bear witness to God, we are God's witnesses. People see us walking the earth, and it's a testament to God. Then when somebody disappears from this world, they move on from this world, that's one less witness. That's a void. In order to fill this void, others need to intensify their work and to proclaim on their own behalf, as well as on behalf of the deceased, exalted and hallowed be his great name. With this perspective, we can understand why reciting the Kaddish elevates the soul of the deceased. The aggregate of a person's actions and accomplishments in this world define his or her life. However, the tally of a person's achievements does not necessarily conclude at the moment of death. A complete evaluation of a person's accomplishments must also include all that is accomplished as a result of the person's inspiration and actions. Therefore, those who remain alive, and especially the person's children and descendants, whose very existence is a credit to their forebears, do good deeds, they contribute to the deceased's balance of accomplishments. For although the deceased is no longer active in this world, his or her actions continue to inspire positive deeds and actions. Right? So that's why it becomes the ultimate thing. That is why the recitation of Kaddish elevates the soul, because God is being exalted in this world as a result of and in the name of the deceased. Okay? Very nice. Having said that, a lot of people this year lost loved ones. There's a pandemic. I don't know if you've heard about it. And a lot of people lost loved ones during this time. And it was especially as difficult and traumatic as losing somebody is in any given time. But during the pandemic, when we don't have that physical closeness and that social connection, in-person connection, makes it far, far more difficult. And such a big part of it is getting together and praying and saying Kaddish and going to synagogue. And now everything is virtual, or has been virtual for the most part. People are being buried alone, and their children are watching on Zoom. People are trying to tune into a class. Everything is on Zoom. Everything is alone. Everything's on Zoom. And an opportunity to say Kaddish, which is something that's done in the presence of a minyan, that's something that can't be done properly. So it's important to remember, we just focused on the significance of Kaddish, but there's something far more important than Kaddish, because everything that we just explained about Kaddish would apply so much more so to every good deed that we do. Kaddish is a declaration of sanctification of God's name. It's a proclamation, and it's a very strong one. Think about children standing over an open grave of the parents, saying Kaddish, exalting God's name, calling out to fill that void. It's incredible to think about something. It's so powerful. But even more powerful than that is the actions, is the deeds, is the life that we live in their honor. Those accomplishments continue to accumulate in the life we live. There's back in the day, I'm sorry, we're going a little off on tangents. It looks like we're going to go a little overtime today, so my apologies. But back in the day, only one mourner said Kaddish during the service in the synagogue. And so what would happen was, if it came that there would be multiple mourners that needed to say Kaddish, so there was a whole system that was worked out. Who gets precedence and who says this Kaddish, and then they would divide the Kaddishes, and this one would say this one, that one would say the other one. That's how that went. It's very hard to fathom that today. Today, we know all the mourners say Kaddish in unison today in Shul, but this is a fairly new phenomenon. It hasn't been going on for so long. So as a result, the fact that one person would get to say Kaddish, you can imagine there's quite a bit of legal halachic literature on this subject and on conflict resolution and on mediation between what do you do with the synagogue, who gets precedence, and how they divide it, and what do you do, and so on and so forth. And so in all of this discussion, it always comes back to this one point, which is that we're doing something in memory of the deceased, memory of that soul. And so one thing for sure is not a benefit to the soul is for their descendants to be fighting and quarreling. That certainly doesn't benefit the soul. And so far greater than the benefit that the soul gets from their child reciting Kaddish for them, they get from their child allowing somebody else, giving somebody else that space, allowing somebody else to do that because it was something that for whatever reason was so important to them. By being able to forego that, that is a far greater benefit to the soul for whom the Kaddish wasn't said. And so this just again emphasizes this point, underlines this point, that the ultimate benefit to the soul is our actions, is our character, the choices that we make, our behaviors, the mitzvahs that we perform in this world. Those are the ultimate benefit to the soul. Now, so we have a little insight into heaven. Sounds like a wonderful place. But as we've been progressing through tonight's class, and as I mentioned, the theme that's been sort of an undercurrent in all of our classes so far, we know that that's not the ultimate goal. If somebody now were to find a cure to COVID, somebody now, some researcher, some scientist came up with the cure for COVID, found the cure, and instantaneously the whole world can go back to normal in an instant. This person will certainly be showered with accolades and will certainly win a Nobel Prize, right? Do you think that sometime in the future, when this person is talking to their grandchildren, reflecting on their life, they would say, you know what the highlight of my life was? Winning the Nobel Prize. Would that be the highlight? No. Obviously, the highlight is the $1 million that goes with the prize. Obviously, everybody knows that with the prize. No, what would be the highlight? Curing COVID, bringing healing to the world, making a difference. Similarly, heaven is the Nobel Prize for winning life, for surviving life, for curing life, whatever you want, whatever word you put in there, right? You've graduated from life in this world, you come to heaven, here's your Nobel Prize. Wonderful. But when souls are sitting around in heaven, are they looking at each other and talking about, look at my cloud is bigger than your cloud, my cloud is fluffier than your cloud, I'm higher, you're lower, my area is sunnier, No, what are they talking about? They're talking about the impact they had in this world. Ultimately, this is the most meaningful. This is the place. So when we talk about heaven, we talk about hell, the reward, the punishment, the consequence, I want to go back to what we read right in the beginning. I think it was text 3. The reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. So we talked before about that in the context of the reward built into the mitzvah. But really, there's something far more profound, which is that the greatest reward for the mitzvah is not the built-in benefit of the mitzvah. It's not the consequence of the mitzvah. It's the actual mitzvah itself, the opportunity to perform a mitzvah. Why? Because, as we've been talking about, the pleasure of paradise, the pleasure of heaven is feeling close to God. But where does that intimacy take place? Where does that closeness actually happen? It happens in the performance of a mitzvah. When we do something for God, when God says, this is what I want, and I want you to do this, and you do this for God, that's where we meet God and satisfy his need. That's where we are of service of God in the most profound ways. So it's great to be with somebody. And when we think about the pleasure we have in our relationships with others, think about the people that you really, really love being with. You know what you love more than being with them? doing for them. Not being with them, but being there for them. That's what you love even more. Which would probably explain why whenever I go home and visit my mother, all she wants to do is make food for me. I'm like, well, why are you making food for me? I can take care of myself. I don't want you to say, I'm here, let's sit at the table. But she wants to make me scrambled eggs. We're going to make scrambled eggs, we're going to make pie, we're going to make this, because the greatest space of that pleasure is being able to do. And that doesn't happen in heaven. In heaven, we hang out with God. But on earth, we get to do for God. Far, far greater. And that is summed up in text 16. When our master and teacher, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, remember, the founder of the Chabad movement, we've been quoting him. This is a statement by his grandson and later successor. So he says, when our master and teacher would enter a state of spiritual ecstasy, he would be heard exclaiming, I want nothing at all. I don't want your paradise. I don't want your world to come. I want nothing but you alone. This is the ultimate sort of Hasidic insight and ideal into everything. That what we really want is not paradise, it's not heaven, it's not that pleasure. We want God. And where do we have him? Yeah, we can feel that closeness. We don't feel that here. With the actions we do, we don't see that, we don't feel it. We get to know about the result, about the impact of our actions when we're in heaven, true. But when are we actually close with God? When is that experience, when is that bond happening? It's happening here in this physical world. So we started our class tonight being worried about going to hell. And it turns out, whatever. I'm sure it's really painful and bad. It's not to diminish it or to belittle it. God willing, we're all spared from the fires of hell for sure. And anyway, we should live, we know we can do something about it in our lifetime now, right? Which is minimize the amount of shame we might feel with less hell. But whatever. And we all came into this class wanting to go to heaven and desired heaven. And turns out heaven, also not so great. This is where it's at. And that's also why, to bring it back to our loved ones who are in heaven, why it's so important that we do, not just for ourselves, but even for them. This is where it's at. So, that's all we have for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining. We'll open it up to some questions. And God willing, next week, we're gonna throw a little curveball at you, because next we're gonna talk about reincarnation. So is heaven the happily ever after or not? What's going on? That we're going to leave for next week. But thank you again. Thanks for sticking around a little bit longer than we normally go. And we'll open it up now to questions.